The black leather billfold slid across the crisp white linen tablecloth, coming to a sudden, deliberate stop right next to my half-empty water glass. I stared down at it, the gold-embossed logo of the restaurant glinting under the dim amber lighting of the dining room. Across the table, my mother Eleanor took a slow, delicate sip of her Cabernet. She didn't bother to look at me. Instead, she adjusted the heavy diamond tennis bracelet, catching the ambient light on her wrist, and smiled warmly at the woman sitting next to her. "Go ahead, Maya," my mother said, her voice dropping into that syrupy, performative register she always reserved for upscale public spaces. "Take care of that for us, will you? It's the absolute least you can do." I reached out and picked up the leather folder. The paper inside was thick and heavily textured. I scanned the itemized list. Imported white truffles, 2 orders of Wagyu beef, 3 bottles of vintage champagne, and a seafood tower that had taken up half the table. The total sitting at the very bottom was $3,142. My chest tightened, a familiar, suffocating pressure settling deep behind my ribs. I looked up. Chloe, my 30-year-old stepsister, sat across from me, casually swirling an olive around the rim of her martini glass. She wore a pristine, tailored white silk blazer that likely cost more than the average person's monthly rent. For the past 2 hours, she had been loudly and proudly detailing her brand new promotion to vice president at a downtown venture capital firm. It was a firm entirely coincidentally where her father happened to be a majority shareholder and board member. "It's a celebration, Maya," Chloe said, tilting her head. Her perfectly blown-out blonde hair cascaded over her shoulder. "Mom just thought it would be a really good learning experience for you. You know, since you're always struggling to understand how high-level finance actually works." I shifted my gaze to Richard, my stepfather. He sat at the head of the table, meticulously cutting his steak into perfect, bite-sized pieces. He didn't look up. He never looked up when Eleanor and Chloe went to work on me. It was far easier for him to play deaf and chew his food than to disrupt the expensive piece of his curated life. "Financial responsibility," my mother chimed in, leaning forward. The flickering candlelight caught the sharp, critical lines of her face. "That's exactly what this is about, Maya. You are 32 years old. You work a comfortable, incredibly standard logistics job. It pays your little bills, I'm sure, but it does not teach you how to operate in the real world." I kept my face perfectly still, refusing to give them the reaction they were so desperately fishing for. "You want me to pay a $3,000 dinner bill to learn financial responsibility? I want you to learn how to contribute to this family's legacy." Eleanor corrected, her tone hardening just a fraction. "Chloe is making massive strides in her industry. She is closing major deals, securing partnerships, and operating at an elite corporate level. Meanwhile, you are still playing it safe. We thought paying for tonight might motivate you. We thought it might show you what actual tangible success tastes like. Maybe it will encourage you to finally step out of that entry-level mindset you cling to." "I have been at my company for 7 years, Mom. I manage the entire Midwest distribution network." Eleanor waved her manicured hand in the air, batting away my entire career like it was a minor buzzing annoyance. Moving cardboard boxes around Maya, its blue-collar warehouse work dressed up in a cheap blazer. Chloe is shaping the future of technology. She is finding the next big startup founders. It's just an entirely different caliber of existence. I looked down at the receipt again, the numbers swimming slightly before my eyes. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the demand burned in my throat. They knew my corporate salary. They knew exactly how much $3,000 would devastate a normal person's bank account. This wasn't a lesson in economics. This was a public execution. This was exactly how the dynamic started 14 years ago. I was 18 when my mother married Richard. Before him, it was just the two of us scraping by in a tiny, drafty apartment on the south side of the city. I used to think my mother and I were a team fighting against the world. I spent my high school years working part-time shifts at a local pharmacy, handing over half my meager paycheck just to help her keep the lights on and the heating bill paid. Then Richard arrived, bringing his sprawling suburban mansion, his elite country club memberships, and his 14-year-old daughter, Chloe. Almost overnight, my mother completely transformed. The tired woman who used to clip grocery coupons with me at the kitchen table suddenly only wore European designer labels. And far more devastatingly, she adopted Richard's daughter as her ultimate vanity project. Chloe was everything Eleanor suddenly wanted to be associated with. She was wealthy by birth, inherently connected to high society, and effortlessly entitled to the world around her. I was the dark, heavy reminder of the struggling life Eleanor was desperately trying to outrun and erase. I vividly remember the day I came home from school, practically vibrating with excitement, clutching a thick envelope containing my acceptance letter to a prestigious local business incubator program. I had spent 6 grueling months developing a business plan for a logistics software platform. It was my ultimate dream. I wanted to build something massive from absolutely nothing. I found Eleanor and Chloe sitting in the sunroom flipping through expensive fabric swatches for Chloe's new bedroom. It happened to be my old bedroom before I was unceremoniously moved to the smaller guest room down the hall to accommodate her wardrobe. When I excitedly showed my mother the acceptance letter, Chloe just laughed. "A tech business, Maya, you don't even own a new laptop. You type on a dinosaur." My mother didn't defend me. She didn't even smile. She just sighed heavily, looking at my letter like it was a coffee stain on her pristine white rug. "Maya, please try to be realistic for once. Entrepreneurship is for people with safety nets. It is for people with backgrounds in that sort of thing. You need to focus on getting a safe, reliable job. Please don't embarrass yourself trying to play in a league you clearly do not belong in." She had gently taken the letter from my hands, crumpled it up, and tossed it into the recycling bin next to her chair. From that day forward, my role was cemented. I was the scapegoat, the family cautionary tale, the practical, unimaginative daughter who severely lacked the grace and brilliance of her newly acquired stepdaughter. The sharp sound of a glass clinking forcefully against the table brought me snapping back to the dimly lit reality of the restaurant. "We do not have all night, Maya," Chloe said, checking her reflection in her phone screen and fixing her lipstick. "I have a very early morning meeting with a massive stealth startup tomorrow. They are practically begging our firm for capital." My jaw tightened so hard my teeth ached. I felt the overwhelming familiar urge to argue. I wanted to defend my worth, to scream across the table that my life had profound value. But I swallowed the bitter words down. Arguing with them was like throwing stones into a bottomless well. They fed on my visible frustration. They desperately wanted to see me sweat, to see me panic over the massive bill, to watch me humiliatingly pull out 3 different credit cards just to cover the cost of their luxury. I didn't shed a single tear. I didn't raise my voice by even a decibel. Instead, I calmly reached into my leather purse. I bypassed the standard everyday bank card I used for my groceries and gas. My fingers brushed past my keys and settled against the cool, heavy metal of a different card, hidden securely in the back zipper pocket. It was a sleek, matte black corporate card. They had absolutely no idea. They didn't know that my standard corporate job moving boxes was just my daytime cover. They didn't know that for the past 4 relentless years I had been working 80-hour weeks. They didn't know I was sleeping 4 hours a night coding and building the exact kind of complex data analytics software my mother had once mocked me for dreaming about. They had no clue that my secret stealth startup had just secured a massive global user base, generating a monthly revenue that made Richard's entire stock portfolio look like pocket change. I pulled the heavy black card out and placed it squarely on top of the billfold. The waiter, who had been hovering nervously a few feet away, stepped forward immediately. He noticed the distinct weight and the sharp metallic clink as he picked the card up off the table. His eyes widened slightly, recognizing a tier of financial access that completely contradicted my modest, unassuming outfit. "Thank you so much, ma'am. I will take care of this right away." he said, bowing his head deeply and respectfully, before scurrying off toward the payment terminal. Eleanor frowned, her eyes tracking the waiter's retreating back. "What kind of card was that?" "Just a card, Mom," I said quietly, keeping my voice utterly devoid of emotion. I picked up my purse and stood from the table. The plush, dark green velvet of the booth brushed softly against the back of my legs. "Where exactly are you going?" my mother demanded, her voice sharp with sudden piercing irritation. "We haven't even ordered dessert yet. Chloe specifically wanted the baked Alaska." "I have a very early morning too," I said, looking down at the two of them. "Congratulations on the promotion, Chloe. I am sure you earned every bit of it." Chloe's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits, searching my face aggressively for any hint of sarcasm, but I kept my expression entirely blank and neutral. "You are leaving." Eleanor's voice rose significantly, drawing the curious attention of a wealthy couple at a nearby table. "After we graciously invited you out to celebrate your sister's achievement, you are going to act this incredibly selfish and ruin the evening." "I paid the bill, Mom, just like you asked me to." I slung my bag over my shoulder, adjusting the strap. "Enjoy the dessert." I didn't wait for her to formulate a response. I turned my back on their stunned, outraged faces and walked gracefully out of the elegant dining room. I pushed through the heavy brass-handled glass doors of the restaurant and stepped out into the biting, freezing chill of the Chicago night. The cold winter air hit my lungs sharp, clean, and invigorating. I took a deep, grounding breath. The city hummed loudly around me, vibrantly alive with the sound of crawling traffic and distant sirens, but my mind was perfectly, beautifully quiet. I felt a profound sense of detachment, a sudden, clean cutting away of the emotional dead weight I had carried on my shoulders for over a decade. I walked 3 blocks toward the damp concrete parking garage, where my sensible 6-year-old sedan was parked. The flickering streetlights cast long, moving shadows on the wet pavement as I walked. Just as I reached into my thick wool coat pocket for my car keys, my phone vibrated aggressively in my palm. I stopped walking, standing under the harsh white glare of a street lamp, and looked down at the glowing screen. It was a text message from my mother. "Your behavior tonight was absolutely disgusting and incredibly disrespectful to Chloe. If you cannot learn how to support your own family, then you are no longer welcome in it. Consider yourself officially uninvited from the reading of your grandmother's estate on Friday morning. Unless you call and apologize to Chloe immediately for leaving early, you will not get a single dime from that house." I stared at the glowing words, the sheer manipulative cruelty of her ultimatum settling into the quiet street around me. She was holding the one place I ever felt truly loved hostage, trying to force me to my knees in submission. A slow, chilling smile touched the corners of my mouth. My mother was leveraging the estate reading to break my spirit. She had absolutely no idea that 2 weeks ago I had already met privately with my grandmother's attorney. She didn't know that using the silent, massive profits from my stealth company, I had completely paid off the property's outstanding debts and back taxes in pure cash. She was threatening to lock me out of my grandmother's house, completely unaware that I already held the legal keys to the front door. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, the harsh white light reflecting off the wet Chicago pavement. My mother's text was a masterclass in manipulation, threatening to lock me out of my grandmother's estate reading unless I begged for forgiveness. I just smiled, slipping the phone into my coat pocket. She was playing a ruthless game of chess on a board I had already purchased. The next morning, the crisp autumn wind whipped through my coat as I unlocked the heavy oak door of my grandmother's house in Oak Park. The air inside still smelled faintly of dried lavender, old paper, and peppermint tea. It was a modest 2-story craftsman with creaky floorboards and faded wallpaper, but to me it was an impenetrable fortress. This was the only place on earth where I was ever allowed to just be Maya. There were no impossible standards here, no relentless, suffocating critiques about my hair, my clothes, or my career. I walked into the living room and ran my hand along the worn floral upholstery of her favorite reading chair. A deep, heavy ache settled in my chest. Eleanor was desperate to put a for sale sign on the front lawn. She needed the quick cash to maintain her country club facade and to silently patch up the bleeding financial holes in Richard's real estate portfolio. The front door clicked open and heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. Marcus walked into the living room carrying 2 large coffees and a box of pastries. Marcus wasn't just my startup co-founder. He was the brother I never had, the only person who knew the crushing weight of the double life I was living. He handed me a cup, his dark eyes scanning the dusty room. "You look like you didn't sleep a single minute," he said, taking a bite of a croissant. "Eleanor ambushed me with a $3,000 dinner bill last night," I said, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. "A little celebration for Chloe's new promotion. Then she texted me threatening to cut me out of the estate reading if I didn't apologize for leaving early." Marcus let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "The audacity is actually staggering. She doesn't even have the legal right to sell this place. You bought out the back taxes through the LLC 2 weeks ago." "I know," I said, leaning against the wooden mantel. "But she doesn't know that yet. And Richard's quiet debts are piling up. They are getting desperate. I just need to keep playing the part of the compliant, struggling daughter a little longer. If they figure out what we are building before the software is ready to launch, they will find a way to take credit for it or worse, destroy it." Marcus nodded slowly, his expression sobering. "Our servers are burning through cash, Maya. We have maybe 2 months of runway left before the platform goes dark. We need that Series B funding and we need it yesterday." "I'll handle the funding," I promised, setting my coffee down. "But first I need to go play my role." I drove out to my mother's sprawling estate in the northern suburbs just after lunch. The house was a towering monument to excess with perfectly manicured hedges, towering marble columns, and a driveway lined with imported luxury cars. It always felt less like a home and more like a museum where you weren't allowed to touch the exhibits. I let myself in through the side door. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that usually preceded a storm. I found my stepfather Richard sitting at the massive kitchen island, nursing a glass of expensive scotch. He wore a crisp golf polo, his silver hair perfectly styled. He gave me a weak, non-committal nod, his eyes quickly darting back to the financial news playing on the wall-mounted television. Richard was a man who purchased his domestic peace by letting my mother bulldoze absolutely anything in her path. He had watched Eleanor actively erase my presence in this house for 14 years, and he had never once raised his voice to stop her. "She's in the formal living room," Richard mumbled, taking a slow sip of his drink. I walked down the wide hallway, my footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. Eleanor was sitting on a white silk sofa, flipping through a high-end catalog. I stood in the doorway, forcing my shoulders to relax, preparing to offer a polite, fabricated apology just to keep the peace. But the words died instantly in my throat. Chloe was walking gracefully down the grand, sweeping staircase. My breath hitched, a sharp physical pain striking the center of my chest. Resting perfectly against Chloe's collarbone was a delicate vintage emerald pendant on a thin gold chain. It was my grandmother's necklace, the one she had worn every single day of her life, the one she had explicitly verbally promised to me on my 16th birthday as we sat together on her porch swing. "Take that off," I said. My voice was low, trembling with a sudden, uncontrollable surge of adrenaline. Chloe paused at the bottom of the stairs, her manicured hand lifting to brush casually against the brilliant green stone. She offered me a sweet, utterly vacant smile. "Maya, I didn't hear you come in. Do you like it?" Mom said it brings out the color in my eyes. Eleanor snapped the catalog shut and stood up immediately, stepping between me and her stepdaughter like a protective guard dog. "Don't start a scene in my house, Maya. Chloe has a very important charity gala to attend tonight. She needed something elegant to complete her outfit." "That is Grandma's necklace," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I curled my hands into tight fists at my sides, my fingernails digging painfully into my palms. She promised it to me. You know she did. Eleanor let out a sharp, condescending sigh, looking me up and down with blatant distaste. Please try to be realistic. You work in a dusty logistics warehouse. When exactly are you going to wear vintage emeralds to the loading dock? Chloe is meeting with venture capitalists. She operates in circles where appearances actually matter. Giving this to you would be a complete waste of a beautiful heirloom. The sheer casual cruelty of her logic hung heavily in the air. She wasn't just taking a piece of jewelry. She was actively stripping away my history, deciding that my life was too small, too insignificant to hold anything of genuine value. Chloe patted Eleanor's arm affectionately. Don't upset her, Mom. Maya just doesn't understand how high-level networking works. It's a completely different world. I stood there vibrating with a profound, consuming rage. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the necklace from her throat. I wanted to pull out my phone and show them the multi-million-dollar valuation of my hidden company. I wanted to watch their arrogant faces crumble into dust. But I swallowed the burning acid in my throat. I looked at Eleanor's cold, calculating eyes, and then at Chloe's smug, satisfied smirk. Giving them a reaction was exactly what they wanted. They fed on my pain. It validated their superiority. Keep it? I said, my voice eerily calm and devoid of all emotion. I turned on my heel, my sensible shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. It matches your personality. I didn't wait to hear Eleanor's inevitable reprimand. I walked straight out the front door, the heavy mahogany slamming shut behind me. I drove back to the safe haven of Oak Park, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned stark white. I didn't cry. Crying was a useless emotion. Instead, I channeled every ounce of that burning humiliation into a cold, unbreakable resolve. I spent the next 8 hours sitting at my grandmother's dining table, my laptop open, my fingers flying violently across the keyboard. I coded until my vision blurred. I refined our predictive algorithms. I built complex firewalls to protect our user data. I poured all my grief, all my anger, and all my rejection into the digital architecture of a company that was going to change the world. Around midnight, the silence of the old house settled heavily around me. I rubbed my burning eyes and walked into the small wood-paneled study at the back of the house. I needed to clear out the heavy roll-top desk before the cleaners arrived next week. I began pulling out old utility bills, faded greeting cards, and bundles of tax returns. As I reached into the very back of the deep bottom drawer, my knuckles brushed against a strange raised groove in the wood. I pressed my fingers against it, and with a soft, mechanical click, a false wooden panel popped loose. My breath caught in my throat. I carefully reached into the hidden dusty compartment and pulled out a thick, yellowed manila envelope. The wax seal on the back was cracked and brittle. I broke it open and slid out a stack of dense legal papers. I sat down slowly in the desk chair, my eyes scanning the faded type. It was a notarized legal document bearing the unmistakable signature of my late grandfather. I read the paragraphs twice, my heart beginning to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It wasn't just a deed. It was a binding, irrevocable legal restriction placed on the estate. The document explicitly, undeniably stripped Eleanor of any legal authority to liquidate, sell, or transfer the property without the direct written consent of my biological father's bloodline. My mother had absolutely no right to sell this house. She never did. A sudden sharp crunch of dry leaves broke the dead silence of the room. I froze, the heavy parchment paper trembling slightly in my hands. A shadow shifted outside the glass of the study window. I slowly looked up, the air catching painfully in my throat, and locked eyes with Chloe, who was standing perfectly still on the dark, unlit porch, her face pressed against the cold window pane, staring directly at the document in my hands. I froze, the thick parchment feeling suddenly heavy and dangerous in my hands. Chloe's eyes were wide in the darkness, illuminated only by the faint amber glow of the study lamp, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. I didn't panic. I deliberately broke eye contact, smoothly folding the document and sliding it deep into the pocket of my wool cardigan. By the time I walked out to the hallway and opened the heavy front door, Chloe was already standing on the porch. She had wrapped her expensive cashmere coat tightly around her shoulders, shivering in the sharp autumn chill. "What are you doing creeping around in the dark, Chloe?" I asked, keeping my voice entirely level. Her eyes darted to my pocket, then back to my face. She offered a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mom wanted me to check on the house. She wanted to make sure you weren't taking anything valuable before the real estate agents arrived. But honestly, I'm glad I ran into you." She reached out and lightly touched my arm. The gesture felt so rehearsed it made my skin crawl. "We got off on the wrong foot the other night," Chloe said, her voice dropping into a sugary, apologetic register. "Mom put so much pressure on both of us. I'd really love to take you to lunch tomorrow. Just the two of us. Sisterly bonding." I knew exactly what she was doing. She was fishing for information. But refusing would only make her more suspicious of what I had found hidden inside that desk. I agreed to meet her, fully intending to keep my guard up. The next day we met at a trendy, loud bistro downtown. I was already exhausted. Juggling the grueling hours of my corporate logistics job to pay my rent while secretly funding my startup was bleeding me dry. My work phone hadn't stopped buzzing all morning, with urgent emails from my biggest corporate account, a massive retail distributor called Omnicorp. They were the crown jewel of my portfolio, the single client keeping me in my boss's good graces so I could collect my paycheck. Chloe ordered a ridiculously expensive salad and spent the first 20 minutes asking pointed, invasive questions about my finances. She wanted to know how I was paying my bills, if I had found a better job yet, and if I had taken anything from grandmother's desk. I deflected every single question with vague complaints about warehouse shifts and tight grocery budgets. She seemed to soak up my fabricated misery like a sponge, her posture relaxing the more I pretended to struggle. Right as the waiter cleared our plates, my personal phone vibrated in my pocket. It was Marcus. I knew he wouldn't call in the middle of the business day unless it was an absolute emergency with our stealth servers. "Excuse me for just a second," I said, sliding out of the leather booth. "I really have to take this." I stepped outside onto the noisy, bustling sidewalk to talk to Marcus, leaving my bulky company-issued work phone sitting face up on the table next to my water glass. It was a massive, amateur mistake. I was so fiercely protective of my startup secrets that I completely neglected to protect my corporate lifeline. When I walked back inside 5 minutes later, Chloe was casually sipping her sparkling water, looking out the window. The work phone was exactly where I had left it, but the glass screen was noticeably warm to the touch when I slipped it into my purse. Exactly 1 week later, the walls of my corporate life completely caved in. I was sitting at my desk, finalizing the quarterly distribution schedule, when my manager called me into his glass-walled office. His face was grim, a stark contrast to the usual praise I received for hitting my targets. He didn't even ask me to sit down. "Omnicorp just pulled their entire contract," he said, his voice hard and uncompromising. "They are moving to a new supply chain model backed by a venture capital firm downtown. A firm that somehow knew exactly what our operating margins were, exactly where our delivery gaps existed, and exactly how to undercut us." The air violently left my lungs. My pulse hammered a frantic, sickening rhythm in my ears. He tossed a printed email onto the center of his desk. It was an official departure announcement from Omnicorp. The venture firm that had successfully pitched the new aggressive takeover was Chloe's firm. "They knew our proprietary pricing, Maya," my boss continued, his eyes narrowing with deep, cold suspicion. "Omnicorp was your account. You were the only one with full access to those specific logistical pain points. The partners are demanding answers, and right now, the only logical conclusion is that you leaked company data to a competitor." I stood there completely paralyzed by the sheer velocity of the betrayal. Chloe hadn't just snooped through my phone to be nosy. She had meticulously memorized my clients' vulnerabilities, taken the data back to her venture capital firm, and orchestrated a hostile takeover of my only source of steady income. "I didn't leak anything," I said, my voice shaking with a dangerous mixture of shock and fury. I swear to you, my stepsister works at that firm. She must have seen my emails when we had lunch. My boss shook his head, looking at me with pure disgust. You're blaming your own sister for your professional negligence. Pack your desk, Maya. You are terminated effective immediately. And consider yourself incredibly lucky we aren't pursuing legal action for corporate espionage. I walked out of the building carrying a small cardboard box of my personal belongings, my mind completely numb. The brutal Chicago wind bit through my thin blouse, but I barely felt the cold. Without my logistics salary, I had absolutely no way to pay for the startup's back-end servers next month. The financial timing was catastrophic. I threw my box into the passenger seat of my car and immediately dialed Chloe's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and overwhelmingly breezy. Maya, I was just thinking about you. You stole Omnicorp, I said, my voice dropping to a low, trembling register. You went through my work phone at lunch, stole my client data, and used it to pitch them. I just got fired, Chloe. There was a brief, calculated pause on the line. Then she let out a soft, dramatic gasp. Maya, what on earth are you talking about? Chloe said, sounding like the absolute picture of wounded innocence. My firm pitches dozens of logistics companies every single week. I had no idea Omnicorp was your personal client. Honestly, if your company was doing a better job keeping them happy, they wouldn't have been looking for outside venture funding. You can't blame me for your own professional shortcomings. I gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles ached. She was enjoying this. She had meticulously engineered my destruction just to ensure I remained the helpless failure of the family, exactly as Eleanor wanted. You knew exactly what you were doing, I whispered, hanging up the phone before she could spew another fake, condescending apology. I sat in the cold car for a long time, the profound weight of the betrayal crushing my chest. I had lost my entire income. My secret company was now in severe jeopardy. In a profound, pathetic moment of weakness, I desperately craved the one thing I had never truly had: a mother's comfort. I just wanted Eleanor to hear what Chloe had done. I wanted her to see just for a second how deeply malicious her golden child actually was. I drove straight to the suburban mansion, my eyes burning with hot, unshed tears. The front door was unlocked, as it usually was during the day. I walked silently through the grand marble foyer, heading toward Eleanor's private study to find her. The heavy wooden door was cracked open. I raised my hand to knock, but my mother's voice drifted out into the hallway. She was laughing, that bright bell-like sound she always reserved for her wealthy country club friends. "Oh, it worked out perfectly," Eleanor was saying casually into her phone. "I spoke to Richard's friend on the Omnicorp board at the club on Sunday. I told him my brilliant stepdaughter had a revolutionary pitch for their supply chain, and he practically begged to set up a meeting with her firm." I froze, my hand hovering mere inches from the door. The floor seemed to completely drop out from underneath me. "Yes, well," Eleanor continued, her tone turning instantly cold and dismissive. "Maya has always been lazy. She was going to lose that job eventually anyway. It's much better that the revenue goes to Chloe's firm. It keeps the success in the family where it actually belongs." I backed away from the heavy oak door of my mother's study, my breath trapped painfully in my throat. My mother's bright socialite laughter echoed down the marble hallway, twisting into something unrecognizable and monstrous. She hadn't just watched Chloe destroy my career. She had actively handed her the weapon, using her own elite network to ensure my professional ruin. I didn't burst into the room. I didn't scream or demand an explanation from the woman who was supposed to protect me. I simply turned around and walked out of the mansion, the cold autumn air stinging my face as I got into my car. The drive back to Oak Park was a blur of calculating numbers and mounting panic. My corporate salary wasn't just my personal livelihood, it was the absolute lifeblood of my startup. I was quietly funneling every spare cent I earned into our operational costs to avoid taking on predatory early-stage debt. Without that steady influx of cash, the massive server farms powering our predictive algorithms would go dark in less than 45 days. Marcus and I were weeks away from our critical Series B funding round, and I was suddenly flying without a parachute. I spent the next 3 days applying for emergency personal loans just to keep the business alive, watching my credit score tank in real time. The suffocating financial dread followed me straight into the formal dining room of my mother's house on Thanksgiving Day. Attendance at these holiday gatherings wasn't a polite request. It was a mandatory performance for Eleanor's carefully curated image, and skipping it would only give them more ammunition to use against me. The long mahogany table was weighed down with crystal glasses, elaborate floral centerpieces, and a heavy toxic tension. I kept my eyes fixed on my plate, pushing a spoonful of roasted vegetables around in slow, deliberate circles. I could feel the hostile energy radiating from the head of the table, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "It's just such a terrible shame about your little logistics job, Maya," Eleanor announced. Her voice sliced clearly through the soft classical music playing in the background. She took a delicate sip of her wine, her eyes gleaming with manufactured pity. "Though I suppose we all saw it coming eventually. You've always lacked a certain professional stamina." Chloe sighed dramatically, adjusting the linen napkin on her lap. "It's a brutal market right now, Maya. If you don't have the instinct for high-level client retention, you just get swallowed whole. You really can't blame them for letting you go." I looked up, meeting Chloe's perfectly innocent, wide-eyed gaze. The sheer audacity of her performance made my blood run cold. She was sitting there eating turkey, fully aware that she had personally orchestrated my termination by stealing my biggest client. Before I could formulate a neutral response, Richard cleared his throat from the head of the table. He set his silver fork down with a definitive clink. "Actually, Maya, your mother and I have been discussing your unfortunate situation. We really hate seeing you flounder like this." Richard folded his hands together, looking at me with the solemn expression of a man offering profound charity. "There is an opening in the mailroom at my corporate office. It's an entry-level assistant position. The pay is minimum wage, but it offers basic health benefits." Chloe leaned forward, her eyes lighting up with vicious predatory delight. "Oh, that's a fantastic idea, Richard. My venture firm is actually moving into the top 2 floors of your building next month. Maya could bring my morning lattes right up to my desk." She offered me a sickeningly sweet smile, her eyes sparkling with malice. "I take a double-shot oat milk vanilla latte. It would be so nice to see a familiar face delivering it every morning." A heavy, suffocating silence descended over the dining room. They were waiting for me to break. They wanted me to accept the absolute degradation, to bow my head and fetch coffee for the woman who had ruined my life. It was the ultimate power play, designed to strip away whatever dignity I had left and force me into permanent submission. I placed my napkin perfectly beside my plate and looked directly at Richard. "Thank you for the offer," I said, my voice steady and completely hollow. "But I will have to decline. I am pursuing other opportunities." Eleanor slammed her wine glass down so hard the crystal stem threatened to snap. "Other opportunities," she scoffed, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch. "You are unemployed, Maya. You have absolutely nothing to your name. You are 32 years old and relying on pathetic delusions to keep yourself warm at night." "I am fine, Mom," I said softly. "I don't need the mailroom job." Eleanor stood up, her chair screeching violently against the hardwood floor, her face flushed with a furious, ugly red. "You are a stain on this family's name," she spat out, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "We offer you a lifeline, and you throw it back in our faces with this unearned arrogance. You are an absolute embarrassment." I didn't flinch. I just stared at her, watching the final frayed threads of our relationship snap in real time. She didn't want to help me. She wanted to own me. "If you refuse to accept our help, then you refuse to be part of this family," Eleanor declared, her chest heaving with rage. "I spoke with the estate lawyers this morning. I am formally cutting you out of the family trust. Every single generational asset, every account, every piece of property is being transferred exclusively to Chloe. You will get nothing from us." The threat echoed against the high vaulted ceilings of the dining room. She expected me to beg. She expected me to fall to my knees and plead for my rightful inheritance. But I already knew the truth about the estate. I knew about the notarized document protecting my grandmother's house, and I knew that her financial threats were completely hollow. Playing the good, compliant daughter was a game I was never going to win, and I was finally done trying. "Okay," I whispered. I pushed my chair back, stood up, and walked away from the Thanksgiving table without a single backward glance. I spent the next 72 hours locked in my grandmother's study, fueled by black coffee and pure, unadulterated survival instinct. I coded until my fingers cramped. I reviewed our pitch deck for the venture capital firms until the slides blurred together. My personal savings account was draining at a terrifying speed. Every time our servers processed a new batch of data, I watched my bank balance drop another few $100s. I had maxed out 2 credit cards just to cover the bandwidth costs for the week. If we didn't close the funding round soon, my entire company would evaporate into thin air. It was past 2 in the morning when my phone violently vibrated against the wooden desk. The sudden noise made me jump, spilling a few drops of cold coffee onto my notebook. I glanced at the screen and saw Marcus's name flashing in the dark room. He never called this late unless the server architecture was actively collapsing. I snatched the phone up, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Marcus, what's wrong? Did the back end crash?" I asked, my voice tight with exhaustion. "Maya, you need to sit down," Marcus said. His voice was incredibly quiet, carrying a heavy, suffocating dread that instantly paralyzed my lungs. "I just got off the phone with the senior partners at Apex Capital." My breath caught in my throat. Apex Capital was our lead investor for the upcoming Series B funding round. They were the only financial lifeline we had left to keep the company alive. "What did they say?" I asked, gripping the edge of the desk so hard my knuckles ached. "They pulled the term sheet, Maya. They are completely backing out of the deal." The room began to spin. The walls of the study felt like they were closing in on me. "Why, we passed their technical due diligence last week. They loved the analytics engine. They said it was revolutionary. They received an anonymous tip this evening," Marcus said, his voice trembling with a barely contained fury. "Someone sent their entire board of directors a highly detailed fabricated report claiming our predictive algorithm is built on stolen open-source code. It's a complete lie, but Apex won't touch us with a 10-foot pole until it's legally cleared." "An anonymous tip," I whispered, my mind racing through the impossible implications. Only a handful of people even knew the name of our stealth startup, let alone the specific venture capital firm we were negotiating with. "How would anyone even know to contact Apex?" "Maya," Marcus said, taking a ragged breath. I traced the IP address attached to the encrypted email. It bounced through 3 different proxy servers, but the originating digital fingerprint was sloppy. He paused, the heavy silence on the line screaming with terrible implications. "The email came from Chloe's venture capital firm." "The email came from Chloe's venture capital firm." The words hung in the dead air of the study, toxic and suffocating. I didn't scream. I couldn't even form the breath required to speak. Chloe hadn't just stolen my corporate salary, she had meticulously hunted down the only other lifeline I possessed and severed it with surgical precision. She wanted me starved out, crawling back to Eleanor on my hands and knees. Marcus and I spent the next 3 hours running the burn rate projections over the phone. We bled the numbers dry, but the math was merciless. Without Apex Capital's Series B injection, and without my logistics paycheck to cover the colossal back-end cloud hosting our predictive algorithms, would shut down in exactly 14 days. 14 days until the revolutionary platform we had built from scratch was permanently deleted. "We freeze everything," I told Marcus, my voice barely a rasp. "Take no salary. I'll liquidate whatever I have. We keep the servers running no matter what. Within 48 hours, my comfortable life was systematically dismantled. I broke the lease on my high-rise apartment, handing over the keys to a bewildered landlord. I drove my reliable practical sedan to a used car lot and sold it for cash, accepting an offer thousands below its value, just to get the wire transfer processed that same afternoon. Every single dollar went directly into the startup's operating account. I packed my life into 3 cardboard boxes and took the city bus to the south side of Chicago. My new home was a cramped 200-square-foot studio above a loud 24-hour laundromat. The walls were stained a nicotine yellow. The radiator hissed a constant aggressive rattle, and the single window overlooked a narrow alleyway, bathed in the harsh blinking crimson glow of a broken neon sign. There was no space for a bed, so I bought a cheap plastic air mattress and shoved it against the peeling far wall. This was the rock bottom Eleanor had always predicted for me. Word travels with vicious speed in wealthy circles. A former neighbor must have seen me hauling boxes onto the public transit, because it didn't take long for the news of my complete destitution to reach the northern suburbs. 3 days after moving into the studio, a sharp, heavy knock rattled my flimsy front door. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled it open, expecting the landlord to complain about the rent check. Instead, I found 4 massive industrial-grade black trash bags heaped onto the scuffed linoleum of the hallway. Sitting on top of the pile was a crisp, cream-colored envelope. I recognized the heavy cardstock immediately. It was Eleanor's personalized stationery. I tore it open. The handwriting was elegant, sharp, and brutally brief. Maya, since you have chosen a life of squalor, rather than accepting our generous help, I am clearing out the last of your clutter from the estate. I have a contractor coming tomorrow to convert your old bedroom into a Pilates studio. Do not contact us again until you are ready to apologize for your deeply embarrassing behavior. She hadn't even come up the stairs herself. She had sent a driver to dump the remnants of my childhood in a dingy hallway like absolute garbage. She was finalizing my physical erasure from her life. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a notification from a social media app I rarely checked. The algorithm, cruel in its timing, pushed Chloe's latest post to the top of my feed. There was Chloe standing on the sweeping balcony of a sprawling glass-walled penthouse overlooking the downtown skyline. She was holding up a shiny new set of keys, her face plastered with a heavily filtered, triumphant smile. The caption read, "So incredibly blessed. Thank you to the most amazing parents in the world for buying me my absolute dream condo, #new beginnings, #family love." Eleanor had bought her a multi-million-dollar penthouse in the sky, while she paid a driver to leave my childhood in trash bags outside a slum. I dragged the heavy plastic bags inside and locked the door. I sank onto the half-deflated air mattress, the cold plastic biting into my skin through my jeans. The silence of the tiny room pressed down on me, heavy and absolute. And finally, the dam broke. I pulled my knees to my chest and sobbed. I wept for the years I had wasted trying to be the perfect, compliant daughter. I grieved for the mother I had always desperately wanted, but never actually had. I cried until my ribs ached and my throat burned with the metallic taste of bile, mourning the absolute, undeniable finality of my family's abandonment. I was completely, utterly alone. Completely. But as the harsh neon light outside flickered, casting erratic crimson shadows across the peeling wallpaper, the tears eventually stopped. The crushing weight of despair didn't break me. It crystallized. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. The desperate, approval-seeking daughter inside me died on that cheap air mattress. In her place, something cold, sharp, and unbreakable took root. I had nothing left to lose. They had stripped me of my job, my home, my family, and my inheritance. They thought they had left me with nothing. They were wrong. They had left me with absolute freedom. I stood up, my muscles aching, and walked over to the heap of black trash bags. I needed to see what fragments of my history Eleanor had deemed worthless enough to discard. I ripped open the first bag. It was full of old middle school debate trophies, faded sketchbooks, and a collection of worn sweaters. I tore into the second bag, my hands sifting blindly through the plastic. My fingers brushed against something hard and heavy wrapped tightly in an old moth-eaten quilt. I pulled it out and let the fabric fall away. It was a thick, leather-bound ledger. The leather was cracked and aged, smelling faintly of dried lavender and old paper, the unmistakable scent of my grandmother. But this wasn't one of the ledgers I had packed from the Oak Park house. This was something Eleanor must have confiscated years ago and completely forgotten about in her rush to clear out my room. A heavy brass lock clamped the cover shut. I grabbed a flathead screwdriver from my meager toolkit and jammed it into the brass keyhole, twisting it with brutal force. The ancient lock snapped with a sharp crack. I opened the heavy cover, the yellowed pages crackling in the cold air of the apartment. It was my grandmother's personal financial diary, dating back over 2 decades. I ran my finger down the first column of faded ink, my eyes scanning the meticulous handwritten numbers. My breath hitched, a sudden icy shockwave traveling down my spine. The entries detailed a series of massive, untraceable wire transfers originating from a shell company. I flipped the page, my hands trembling violently, as I followed the paper trail of offshore accounts and hidden corporate entities. The ledger laid it out in undeniable mathematical clarity. My grandmother hadn't just suspected Richard of financial misconduct, she had documented the exact source of his initial real estate empire. The seed money that built his entire portfolio, the wealth that Eleanor now flaunted, wasn't earned. It was stolen. The ink on the yellowed pages seemed to burn directly into my retinas. My biological grandfather's proprietary logistics patent, the exact routing algorithm that had revolutionized mid-market shipping in the early 90s, had been meticulously drained, stripped, and legally obscured. Richard hadn't built an empire. He had cannibalized my family's legacy to fund Eleanor's country club lifestyle and Chloe's trust fund. I didn't scream. The crushing grief that had been paralyzing me just moments ago vaporized, instantly replaced by a crystalline, hyper-focused clarity. I picked up my phone and dialed Marcus. He answered groggily, the rustling of sheets echoing over the line. He was likely expecting more bad news about our server costs, preparing himself for the inevitable conversation about shutting down our systems. "We are pivoting," I told him, the words sharp, fast, and completely devoid of hesitation. "We aren't just optimizing supply chain logistics anymore. We are reversing the algorithm." "Maya, it's 3 in the morning. Reversing it how?" I explained the ledger. I told him exactly how Richard had buried the stolen patent through a labyrinth of shell companies, offshore accounts, and obscured asset transfers. Our AI was already designed to track massive, complex data flows to predict supply chain failures. If we tweaked the neural network, if we fed it the specific legal and financial maneuvers detailed in my grandmother's diary, it could hunt down anomalies. It could track hidden corporate ownership, expose patent theft, and unravel financial discrepancies that human auditors would take years to find. We could build the ultimate corporate lie detector. Marcus was silent for a long beat. Then the rapid, rhythmic clacking of a mechanical keyboard echoed over the line. "The architecture can handle it," Marcus said, his voice dropping into that quiet, intense register he only used when he saw a clear path through impossible code. "But Maya, we have less than 12 days before the server hosts pull our plug. If we do this, we have to tear the existing backend down to the studs and rebuild it while the clock is ticking." "Tear it down," I said. We didn't sleep. The cramped studio above the 24-hour laundromat became our war room. The constant, aggressive thumping of the commercial washing machines downstairs became the metronome for our frantic coding. We survived on cheap instant ramen tap water and sheer unadulterated adrenaline. I poured every last ounce of my humiliation, my anger, and the heavy truth of my grandmother's ledger into reshaping the software. We weren't just building a product anymore, we were building a weapon. By day 9, we had a working prototype. It was raw, aggressive, and terrifyingly accurate. Marcus pulled every favor he had accumulated from his old tech contacts to secure a Hail Mary pitch meeting with Sentinel Ventures, one of the most notoriously ruthless top-tier venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. Getting in front of them was a miracle, but we faced an immediate glaring problem. We couldn't afford flights to California. We couldn't even afford a professional co-working space to take the video call. I tacked a plain white bedsheet over the peeling, nicotine-stained wallpaper of my studio. I stacked 3 empty cardboard boxes on top of my air mattress to create a makeshift standing desk, balanced my laptop precariously on top, and logged into the most important meeting of my life. 6 stern-faced partners stared back at me through the screen. They were sitting in a sleek, glass-walled boardroom in Palo Alto, bathed in natural California sunlight. They looked bored, their expressions skeptical, ready to dismiss us as just another desperate, unfunded startup running on fumes. I didn't give them the chance. I bypassed the standard pleasantries, skipped the introductory slides, and launched straight into the live demonstration. I didn't speak like a desperate, unemployed founder facing imminent eviction. I spoke with the lethal, unshakable authority of a woman who had seen the absolute worst of corporate greed firsthand. I guided them through the interface, sharing my screen, as our AI ingested a massive, publicly available dataset from a defunct, corrupt energy corporation. Standard auditing software looks for what is there. I explained, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet of my makeshift office. Our engine looks for what is missing. It maps the negative space. I hit the execute command. On the screen, a complex web of data points illuminated. Red lines shot across the interface, instantly isolating 3 dummy corporations and tracking a hidden stream of embezzled funds straight to an offshore holding account. It did in 14 seconds what a team of forensic accountants had taken 3 years to prove in federal court. I poured every ounce of the degradation at the Thanksgiving table, every sneer from Chloe, and every stolen dollar from my grandfather's legacy into my delivery. I wasn't just selling a compliance tool. I was selling undeniable, immutable truth in a corporate world built entirely on shadows and deception. When I finished the presentation, the screen was dead silent. For an agonizing 30 seconds, none of the partners moved. My heart hammered against my ribs, the sound of the washing machines downstairs suddenly seeming deafening. I kept my posture perfectly straight, refusing to let my eyes dart away from the camera lens. Finally, the lead partner, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn with silver hair and a notoriously unforgiving reputation, leaned forward. She rested her elbows on the polished mahogany table and clasped her hands together. "Your predictive modeling is incredibly aggressive, Ms. Vance," Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the silence. "If your engine functions consistently at this speed, it isn't just a compliance tool. It is a multi-billion-dollar industry disruptor." Marcus let out a sharp, quiet exhale of relief over our shared audio channel. "We are prepared to offer a Series B term sheet covering your full asking price, plus an immediate unrestricted bridge loan to keep your servers operational." Evelyn continued, her gaze locked onto mine through the digital feed. The relief that washed over me was so profound, my knees nearly buckled. It was salvation. It was the absolute validation of everything I had sacrificed. However, Evelyn added, raising a single manicured finger, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Sentinel Ventures does not write blank checks for theoretical frameworks. The defunct energy company was a nice parlor trick, but we already knew the answers to that puzzle. We need a live, real-world stress test. "Name the target," I said, my voice completely unwavering. We want an unannounced deep dive audit of a major high-profile portfolio. We want your software to penetrate their public filings, cross-reference their supply chain logistics, and map their obscured assets within 48 hours. If your engine can flag a legitimate undiscovered discrepancy in a notoriously ironclad firm, the funding is yours. Evelyn tapped a key on her tablet. A notification chimed on my laptop. I've just securely transferred the target dossier, she said. We look forward to reviewing your findings on Friday morning. Good luck, Ms. Vance. The video call abruptly ended, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the dark screen. My hands were shaking as I minimized the video window and clicked on the encrypted file Sentinel Ventures had just sent. The document unzipped, populating a heavy, dense portfolio of corporate tax IDs, real estate holdings, and operational subsidiaries onto my monitor. I stared at the bold black lettering at the very top of the title page, the air violently leaving my lungs. Sentinel Ventures hadn't chosen a random corporation. They had assigned me to audit Richard's real estate and logistics firm. Staring at the bold black lettering of Richard's corporate entity on my cracked monitor, a terrifyingly cold smile spread across my face. Evelyn hadn't just handed me a test. She had handed me the exact weapon I needed, fully loaded and chambered. It was a serendipitous alignment of fate so perfect, it almost felt orchestrated by my grandmother herself. I didn't hesitate. I typed a single-word reply to the partners at Sentinel Ventures and hit send. Accepted. 72 hours later, an 8-figure wire transfer hit our newly established corporate account. The suffocating financial dread that had lived in my chest for months dissolved, replaced by a ruthless, hyper-focused energy. We didn't celebrate. We didn't pop champagne. Marcus and I immediately packed up our makeshift war room and moved our servers out of the dingy apartment above the laundromat. We secured a full floor in a sleek glass and steel high-rise in the downtown tech corridor, accessible only by biometric keycards. The sweeping views of the Chicago skyline were a stark contrast to the blinking neon sign of my previous alleyway, but I rarely took the time to look out the windows. We had a deadline, and failure was mathematically impossible. For the next 12 months, I operated in total disciplined silence. I became a ghost. Scaling the technology required a grueling, obsessive commitment. We hired a dedicated team of 30 elite engineers, data scientists, and forensic accountants, binding every single employee to ironclad non-disclosure agreements. We built a digital fortress around our operations. Our company remained entirely in stealth mode. To the outside corporate world, we simply did not exist. To my family, I was still the disgraced, unemployed daughter wallowing in squalor. I actively cultivated that illusion. I kept my old cell phone number active and maintained a mail forwarding service tied to a dilapidated P.O. box on the south side. Every few weeks, my phone would light up with a message from Eleanor dripping with manufactured pity and venom. Chloe mentioned she saw someone who looked like you standing in the rain at a bus stop. One text read, "If you are struggling to afford groceries, Richard is willing to have his assistant drop off some canned goods. Let us know." I would sit in my corner office wearing tailored designer suits, looking at a bank account with commas I used to only dream about, and calmly type back, "I am managing fine, Mom. Thank you." Feeding their superiority complex was the perfect camouflage. While they were busy congratulating themselves on my supposed ruin, my team was meticulously tearing Richard's empire apart bite by bite. The audit was a monumental undertaking. Richard's firm utilized military-grade firewalls and a sprawling labyrinthine network of nested shell corporations designed specifically to confuse human regulators. But our AI didn't think like a human. It didn't get tired, it didn't get overwhelmed by scale, and it didn't miss microscopic anomalies. Marcus and our lead engineers mapped the negative space of Richard's financial history, cross-referencing public tax filings against the proprietary supply chain algorithms we already knew he was using. We fed my grandmother's decades-old ledger into the neural network, establishing the baseline parameters of his original theft. What the engine uncovered over the next several months was far worse than a single stolen logistics patent. The rot went down to the bedrock of his entire portfolio. Richard was running a sophisticated, ongoing criminal syndicate. The AI isolated massive discrepancies in his commercial property valuations, revealing systematic tax evasion on a federal scale. He was inflating asset values to secure massive domestic loans, then artificially depreciating those same assets to avoid capital gains, funneling the illicit margins into a series of untraceable offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. It was textbook wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering, all hidden behind the glossy philanthropic facade he presented to the elite social circles of our city. Watching the undeniable proof populate on our massive conference room monitors took a heavy emotional toll. For weeks, I barely slept. I was leading a double life, bearing the psychological weight of knowing that the opulent lifestyle Eleanor and Chloe paraded around was funded by stolen money and active felonies. There were nights I wanted to pick up the phone, call the authorities, and burn it all to the ground instantly. But I held my fire. Evelyn and Sentinel Ventures demanded a flawless, irrefutable audit. I needed the final report to be mathematically bulletproof. By the end of the year, our software was no longer just a prototype. It was a fully realized, unstoppable digital force. We closed our Series C funding round in total secrecy, pushing our corporate valuation past the $1 billion mark. We had achieved unicorn status. I was 33 years old, and I possessed more liquid wealth and institutional power than Richard had accumulated in his entire lifetime. With that power came the ability to finally heal. I stopped mourning the family I had lost and started cherishing the chosen family I had built. Marcus wasn't just my co-founder. He was the fiercely loyal brother I had never had. My engineering team protected me, respected my leadership, and shared my relentless drive. I no longer needed Eleanor's validation to feel whole. I had forged my own worth in the fires of her rejection. Quietly, methodically, I began reclaiming my true legacy. I established a blind trust through a boutique wealth management firm in Geneva. Using layers of corporate anonymity, I started buying back the assets Eleanor had carelessly liquidated over the years. I purchased my grandmother's original estate, paying double the asking price to a stunned developer just to ensure the deed transferred immediately into my trust. I tracked down her antique jewelry, her vintage cars, and the parcels of land she had loved, securing them all under my total control. Standing alone in the foyer of my grandmother's house, listening to the silence of the empty halls that now legally belonged to me, I felt a profound, settling peace. I was piecing my history back together, one silent acquisition at a time. The trap was fully set. The audit report was finalized, bound in a secure digital vault, and prepared for transfer to Sentinel Ventures, and subsequently, the Securities and Exchange Commission. We were just waiting for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. That moment arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at the head of our mahogany conference table, reviewing the final lines of code with Marcus, when my executive assistant knocked softly on the glass door. She stepped into the room holding a thick, oversized envelope that had been routed through my Southside P.O. box. "This just came through the forwarding service, Maya," she said, placing it carefully on the table. It looked personal. I recognized the heavy, textured cardstock immediately. I could almost smell Eleanor's signature floral perfume clinging to the paper. I sliced the seal open with a silver letter opener. Inside was an extravagant gold-foiled invitation. The embossed calligraphy announced a highly exclusive black-tie charity gala hosted by the city's elite commerce board, honoring the visionary business achievements of Richard and Chloe's venture capital firm. It was the social event of the decade designed to cement their status as corporate royalty. A small personalized note card fluttered out of the envelope and landed face up on the polished wood table. It was written in Eleanor's unmistakable sharp handwriting. Maya, I am sending this purely out of biological obligation. Your stepfather and sister are receiving the city's highest honor next week. I expect you will ignore this as you usually do, but if you miraculously decide to show your face, please try to find something appropriate at a thrift store. I will not have you embarrassing us in front of the press. I stared at the note, the gold foil of the invitation catching the overhead lights. They were gathering the city's wealthiest elites, the press, and the political establishment in one room to celebrate their stolen empire. I looked up at Marcus, sliding the invitation across the table toward him. My heart beat with a slow, heavy, predatory rhythm. Tell the team to prep the servers, I said, my voice echoing with absolute icy finality. We're launching the audit next week, live. The thick, gold-foiled invitation sat in the center of my sleek, glass-topped desk, looking like an artifact from a lifetime I no longer recognized. Eleanor's personalized note was still clipped to the front, her elegant handwriting dripping with the same toxic condescension that had defined my entire childhood. Find something appropriate at a thrift store. I traced the embossed lettering that proudly announced Richard and Chloe as the city's premier visionaries of commerce. A cold, quiet smile touched my lips. They were hosting a lavish, self-congratulatory charity gala, parading their stolen wealth in front of the city's elite, completely blind to the tidal wave currently cresting over their heads. While my family busied themselves with seating charts and caterers, the American financial sector was being consumed by a single deafening rumor. Wall Street and Silicon Valley were buzzing with frantic whispers about a mysterious tech unicorn preparing for a massive initial public offering. The industry insiders knew only the barest details. An advanced artificial intelligence platform had been developed that could instantly expose corporate compliance failures, patent fraud, and supply chain irregularities with terrifying surgical precision. We had officially named the company Aura Analytics. Our S-1 filing was drafted, our underwriters were secured, and our valuation had officially crossed the billion-dollar threshold. Yet the identity of the founders remained the most fiercely guarded secret in the financial world. We operated behind layers of impenetrable corporate NDAs and blind trusts. To the global markets, the CEO of Aura Analytics was an elusive genius. To my family, I was still the disgraced, unemployed failure living in squalor. I actively cultivated their delusion. Every week, I checked the burner phone tied to my dilapidated South Side P.O. box. Eleanor would periodically send pitying, passive-aggressive text messages asking if I had found a job sweeping floors yet, or if I needed her to send Richard's driver over with canned goods. Sitting in my sprawling downtown corner office wearing tailored designer suits and commanding a team of 30 elite engineers, I would calmly type back vague, non-committal replies. I am managing fine, Mom. Just taking it one day at a time. Feeding their superiority complex was the perfect camouflage, because while they were looking down on me, my team was meticulously tearing Richard's empire apart, bite by bite. The audit was a masterpiece of forensic destruction. Richard's firm utilized military-grade firewalls and a sprawling, labyrinthine network of nested shell corporations designed specifically to confuse human regulators and obscure his paper trails. But our AI didn't think like a human. It didn't get exhausted, it didn't get overwhelmed by scale, and it never missed a microscopic anomaly. Marcus and our lead data scientists mapped the negative space of Richard's financial history. We fed my grandmother's decades-old ledger into the neural network, establishing the baseline parameters of his original logistics patent theft. What the engine uncovered over the next 12 months was infinitely worse than a single stolen algorithm. Late on a Thursday evening, just days before the gala, Marcus walked into my office. The downtown skyline glittered behind him, but his face was illuminated only by the pale, stark light of his tablet. He slid it across my desk without a word. The audit was fully complete, packaged, and legally verified. I scrolled through the final devastating results, my breath catching in my throat. Richard wasn't just a ruthless businessman. He was running a sophisticated, ongoing criminal syndicate. The AI had isolated massive systemic discrepancies in his commercial property valuations. He was inflating his asset values to secure massive domestic loans, then artificially depreciating those exact same assets to avoid capital gains taxes. The illicit margins were being aggressively funneled into a series of untraceable offshore accounts in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands. It was textbook wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering, all hidden behind the glossy philanthropic facade he presented to his elite social circles. His entire empire was a fragile house of cards, suspended over a legal abyss. And I was holding the only pair of scissors sharp enough to cut the rope. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Chloe was drowning. Through our industry monitoring software, Marcus and I tracked the growing panic within her venture capital firm. Chloe's portfolio was bleeding out. The flashy, superficial startups she had aggressively championed over the past year were hemorrhaging cash, and her senior partners were demanding a major immediate win. Desperate to secure her partnership and save her lagging reputation, Chloe had become obsessed with finding the mystery tech unicorn. She was aggressively hunting Aura Analytics, trying to secure a late-stage buy-in to save her career. She was throwing Richard's money around, utilizing every unethical back-channel connection she possessed, completely unaware that the elusive founder she was desperately trying to woo was the very stepsister she had systematically destroyed. With the audit finalized and the SEC whistleblower packet encrypted and ready for deployment, I finally responded to Eleanor's gala invitation. From my burner phone, I sent a 2-word text, "Will attend." Then I went shopping. I didn't go to a thrift store. I walked into the most exclusive appointment-only evening wear atelier in downtown Chicago. For the past year, I had worn nothing but practical slacks and oversized sweaters, hiding my ambition and my pain behind a veil of relentless, exhausted coding. That era was officially over. I was healing. I had found my true chosen family in Marcus and my dedicated team, and I was finally shedding the heavy, suffocating need for my mother's approval. I stood on a velvet pedestal as a team of master seamstresses pinned and fitted a custom-tailored floor-length gown. It was a masterpiece of structural silk, a deep liquid sapphire that caught the light like crushed diamonds. It didn't just fit me, it armored me. As I looked at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirrors, the timid, people-pleasing girl who had nervously pushed roasted vegetables around her plate on Thanksgiving was completely unrecognizable. I was the CEO of a billion-dollar company. I was holding the match that would burn my abusers to the ground. I was preparing to step out of the shadows and walk directly into the very world that had so callously rejected me. The morning of the gala dawned crisp and clear. The tension in our office was electric. The team was quietly monitoring the final preparations for our IPO announcement, set to coincide with the delivery of the audit to federal regulators. At 3 p.m., exactly 4 hours before the gala's red carpet was scheduled to open, a shrill, piercing alarm echoed through our server room. The digital tripwire we had set up around our external communications had been triggered. A high-level security breach protocol flashed across the main monitors in red warning text. Marcus burst into my office, his face pale and his eyes wide with a rare, unfiltered panic. He didn't even knock. "Maya, someone just bypassed the secondary firewalls at Apex Capital," Marcus said, his voice tight. "They intercepted a highly classified encrypted email between their senior banking partners and our lead underwriters." My blood ran cold. Apex Capital was the mutual banking contact that bridged our underwriters and Chloe's venture firm. What was in the email, Marcus? The unredacted executive summary for Aura Analytics. He replied, his fingers flying across his laptop keyboard as he traced the breach. The final IPO filing document. The one with your full name and photograph listed as the sole founder and CEO. Who intercepted it? I demanded, moving to stand behind him, my eyes locked on the scrolling lines of code as the system hunted down the digital fingerprint of the intruder. Marcus hit the final keystroke. The IP address resolved on the screen, pinging a location just a few miles away in the city's wealthiest district. He looked up at me, the harsh glow of the monitor reflecting in his glasses. It was Chloe. Chloe stared at the glowing monitor in her plush, glass-walled office, the ambient hum of the city traffic below entirely drowned out by the violent rushing of blood in her ears. The intercepted Apex Capital email was open on her screen. The attached unredacted S1, filing for Aura Analytics, the mysterious billion-dollar unicorn she had spent weeks desperately trying to hunt down for her firm, was fully illuminated. There, under the heading of Founder and Chief Executive Officer, was a high-resolution corporate portrait of my face. Chloe's manicured fingers gripped the edge of her mahogany desk so hard her knuckles turned white. She hyperventilated, her breath coming in short, shallow rasps. It was impossible. It had to be a mistake, a prank, or some elaborate front. The disgraced, unemployed stepsister who had been banished from their Thanksgiving table couldn't possibly be the architect of the most anticipated tech IPO of the decade. But the digital banking logs, the verified SEC routing numbers, and the encrypted signatures didn't lie. Panic quickly transmuted into a toxic, desperate calculation. If she told Richard and Eleanor now, the ensuing explosion would shatter the evening's gala, ruining the very event designed to celebrate their supremacy. If she told her senior partners at the venture firm, she would have to admit that the golden goose they were bleeding capital to find was owned by the family scapegoat she had publicly mocked. Chloe slammed her laptop shut, her chest heaving. She wouldn't tell them. She would corner me at the gala. She would use our shared history leverage, a threat, or manufacture a lie to force a private equity buyout before the public offering went live. She convinced herself she could still spin this, still manipulate the board, still win. She shoved the laptop into her designer bag and sprinted toward the elevator, her hands shaking violently. 3 hours later, I stepped out of a sleek black town car and onto the velvet-roped red carpet outside the city's most historic, opulent ballroom. The air was electric thick with the flash of paparazzi cameras and the low, steady hum of wealth. For the past year, I had worn nothing but practical slacks and oversized sweaters, hiding my ambition and my exhaustion behind a veil of relentless cloistered coding. That era was officially over. I wore the custom-tailored floor-length sapphire gown. It was a masterclass in structural silk, catching the light with a quiet, undeniable dominance. It didn't scream for attention with sequins or plunging necklines. It demanded absolute respect through perfect, lethal elegance. I didn't walk like the timid, anxious girl who used to shrink into the wallpaper of Richard's mansion. I walked with the crystalline, unshakable posture of a woman who held the financial execution orders for half the men in the room. Marcus walked beside me, looking razor-sharp in a bespoke tuxedo, his presence a silent, grounding force. We surrendered our coats, accepted crystal flutes of champagne from passing silver trays, and stepped through the gilded double doors into the grand hall. It didn't take long for the predators to circle. Maya, Eleanor's voice cut through the ambient chatter of the string quartet like a diamond scratching against glass. I turned slowly. My mother was descending upon me, draped in heavy, ostentatious diamonds, flanked by two of her wealthiest, most notoriously venomous country club friends. Richard was 20 yards away, holding court with a group of local politicians oblivious to my arrival. Eleanor stopped 2 feet from me. Her eyes immediately snapped up and down my frame, automatically searching for the flaw, the crack, the evidence of my inherent failure. When she found none, her jaw tightened infinitesimally. "I am genuinely shocked you had the nerve to show up," Eleanor said, her voice pitched perfectly to carry to her friends, but remain a polite murmur to the wider room. She offered a tight, condescending smile. "Though I suppose free champagne is hard to turn down in your situation. The dress is a decent replica, darling. Though the stitching on the bodice gives it away, renting knockoffs is a dangerous game in this crowd." Her friends offered synchronized, pitying laughs. A year ago, that comment would have made my face burn with shame. It would have made me stammer an excuse and look at the floor. Tonight, I just looked at her. I didn't frown. I didn't defend myself. I offered her a slight, calm smile of profound, absolute pity. "It's custom, Eleanor," I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and completely devoid of intimidation. "But I understand how authenticity can be difficult for you to recognize. You've spent so long wearing things Richard bought with other people's money." Eleanor's smile vanished instantly. The two women beside her physically recoiled, exchanging shocked glances. Eleanor opened her mouth, her eyes flashing with a sudden, vicious fury, preparing to verbally eviscerate me in the center of the ballroom. Before she could draw a breath, the crowd behind her parted. "Maya Marcus, thank God you're finally out of the bunker." Evelyn, the notoriously ruthless lead partner from Sentinel Ventures, strode directly into our circle. She was a titan in this room, a woman whose mere presence dictated the flow of capital in the city. Evelyn completely ignored Eleanor, stepping right in front of my mother to grasp my hand with genuine, fervent respect. "The final S1 filings are immaculate, Maya," Evelyn continued, her voice projecting with absolute authority. "Apex Capital is already fielding calls from every institutional investor on the eastern seaboard. You've caused a riot." Eleanor stood frozen, literally pushed to the periphery of the conversation. Her mouth was slightly open. Within seconds, the gravity of the room shifted. A senior managing director from Apex Capital, a man Richard had been desperately trying to secure a meeting with for 6 months, noticed Evelyn and hurried over. "Ms. Vance," the banking director said, extending his hand to me, bowing his head slightly. "An absolute honor. The analytics engine your team built, it's a paradigm shift. We are thrilled to be underwriting the launch." More figures approached. Heavyweights, venture capitalists, tech moguls, and federal regulators who were attending the charity gala. They flocked to our circle, drawn by the invisible magnetism of pure, unadulterated power. They whispered, they pointed, and they lined up to shake my hand. I caught sight of Richard. He had finally noticed the commotion. He abandoned his conversation with the politicians and hurried over to Eleanor's side, his brow furrowed in confusion. They both stood on the outside of the tightening circle of elites, watching in mounting silent horror as the most powerful people in the state completely bypassed them to eagerly greet the daughter they had discarded as a pathetic failure. I locked eyes with Richard through the crowd. I didn't gloat. I simply raised my champagne flute an inch in his direction, sealing the silent promise I had made to my grandfather's legacy. Suddenly, a set of melodic chimes echoed through the ballroom, signaling the beginning of the formal dinner. The crowd began to disperse toward the dining tables. Eleanor grabbed Richard's arm, her face pale beneath her makeup, whispering frantically into his ear. They hurried toward their VIP table, situated directly in front of the main stage, their posture rigid with confusion and panic. I was escorted by Evelyn to a different VIP table, a strictly cordoned-off booth hosted by the elite underwriting syndicate. The lights dimmed. A single spotlight illuminated the podium. Arthur Sterling, a legendary tech investor and the keynote speaker for the evening, walked up the steps to the microphone. The room fell into a hushed, reverent silence. Richard leaned forward at his table, straightening his tie, expecting the customary praise for his firm's sponsorship of the event. "We are gathered tonight to honor the visionaries of our city." Arthur's booming voice resonated through the speakers. "But the truest vision doesn't come from those standing comfortably in the spotlight, maintaining the status quo. True vision comes from those who build empires in the dark, those who possess the courage to completely dismantle corrupt, outdated systems. Arthur paused, looking out over the sea of faces. His eyes landed directly on my table. Tonight, we are not just celebrating charity, we are celebrating a paradigm shift in global finance. I ask you all to raise a glass to the most brilliant, resilient mind in this room. The woman who has just redefined corporate accountability and the soon-to-be billionaire CEO of Aura Analytics, Ms. Maya Vance. The spotlight swung across the cavernous gilded ceiling of the ballroom and locked directly onto my table. For a fraction of a second, the room was suspended in absolute breathless silence. Then the titans of industry, the venture capitalists and the political heavyweights surrounding me rose to their feet. The applause started as a low, thunderous rumble and rapidly escalated into a deafening roar. It reverberated through the crystal chandeliers and vibrated against the marble floors. I didn't immediately stand. I allowed myself one long, steady exhale, feeling the suffocating weight of the past 3 decades finally detach itself from my shoulders. When I stood, the custom sapphire silk of my gown caught the harsh glare of the spotlight, reflecting it back into the room. I looked past the cheering executives at my table and found my family in the front row. Eleanor was frozen. Her champagne flute was tilted dangerously in her hand, the expensive vintage spilling silently onto the pristine white tablecloth. Her jaw had gone slack, her perfectly manicured facade shattering into 100 unrecognizable pieces as her brain violently rejected the reality playing out in front of her. Beside her, Richard looked physically ill. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a splotchy, sickly gray. He was gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly, his knuckles were bone white, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked staccatos. But it was Chloe who broke first. From my vantage point, I watched the raw, unfiltered terror completely consume my stepsister. She knew what this meant. She knew the unredacted S1 filing she had illegally intercepted earlier that afternoon wasn't a glitch or a phantom document. It was a death sentence for her career. In a room filled with the very partners she was desperate to impress, the golden goose they had all been hunting was standing 30 feet away, entirely out of her reach. Desperation is a dangerous, blinding emotion. Rather than sitting quietly in her defeat, Chloe frantically attempted to hijack the narrative. She jumped to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She turned to the senior partners of her venture firm, sitting at the adjacent table. Her voice pitched artificially high, laced with a hysterical edge that cut through the surrounding applause. "We are so incredibly proud of her," Chloe projected, gesturing wildly toward me, while plastering a manic, trembling smile onto her face. "My firm has been quietly backing Aura Analytics since its inception. It's been a closely guarded family partnership. We seeded the initial development." The whispers ignited instantly. The nearby investors and journalists leaned in their eyes, darting between Chloe's frantic performance and my calm, illuminated silhouette. Chloe was attempting a blatant, desperate lie to save her lagging portfolio, hoping she could somehow claim ownership of my triumph before I had the chance to speak. She was banking on the old family dynamic, relying on the assumption that I would stay silent and allow her to take the credit just as I had done my entire life. She had profoundly miscalculated. I broke my gaze away from her and began the long walk toward the main stage. The crowd parted for me instinctively. I didn't rush. I didn't look at the floor. I kept my posture perfectly aligned, ascending the carpeted stairs with a steady, lethal grace. Arthur Sterling met me at the podium. The legendary investor, a man who had famously dismantled some of the most corrupt corporations in modern history, offered me a warm, deeply respectful smile. He handed me the microphone and stepped back, yielding the floor entirely to me. The applause tapered off into a hushed electric anticipation. Thousands of eyes stared up at me. Thank you, Arthur, for that extraordinary introduction. I began, my voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. It was smooth, steady, and completely unwavering. And thank you to the Commerce Board for hosting us tonight. I paused, letting the acoustics settle before shifting my gaze directly down to the VIP tables in the front row. I locked eyes with Chloe. She was still standing, her chest heaving, wearing a strained, victorious smile for the benefit of her colleagues. I understand there has been intense speculation regarding the origins of Aura Analytics. I continued, my tone dropping into a cool, professional register. And I hear whispers in the room tonight attempting to claim a piece of that origin story. So before we proceed to the IPO details, allow me to formally correct the record. The silence in the ballroom became so profound you could hear the subtle hum of the air conditioning. Aura Analytics was not born in a venture capital boardroom. I stated, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable clarity. We did not receive seed funding from any established firms. We were not quietly backed by any familial partnerships, and we certainly did not accept a single dime of support from the institutions currently attempting to claim credit for our architecture. Chloe's manic smile vanished. She dropped back into her chair as if she had been physically struck, the blood rushing to her cheeks in a violently crimson flush. Her senior partners slowly turned to look at her, their expressions hardening into cold, professional disgust. I didn't stop. I turned my eyes to Eleanor. This company was built in a cramped, unheated studio apartment above a 24-hour laundromat on the south side, I said, holding my mother's horrified gaze. It was built on cheap ramen tap water and the relentless, exhausting pursuit of the truth. It was built without safety nets, without privilege, and entirely without the support of a family. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't throwing a tantrum. I was simply laying the absolute, irrefutable facts on the table for the most powerful people in the city to examine. Aura Analytics was designed to map the negative space of corporate deception. I told the crowd, my voice carrying the weight of everything I had survived. We built the ultimate lie detector because we understood firsthand what it looks like when people hide behind false legacies. We built it completely independently. And as of next week, when we open on the exchange, we will remain fiercely, immutably independent. I lowered the microphone. For 3 agonizing seconds, the room processed the execution I had just carried out. I had not resorted to cruelty or petty insults. I had simply held up a mirror of unvarnished truth, and the reflection had publicly incinerated Eleanor and Chloe's entire social facade. Then the applause returned. It wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping of high society. It was a roaring, genuine ovation from a room full of sharks who respected nothing more than a ruthless, self-made victor. I handed the microphone back to Arthur, offered a brief nod of gratitude, and descended the stairs on the opposite side of the stage. I bypassed the main dining floor, slipping past the velvet curtains, and into the quiet, marble-lined corridor that led toward the private executive suites. I needed a moment to breathe, to let the adrenaline subside, but I wasn't alone. The heavy thud of frantic footsteps echoed against the marble behind me. I turned to see Richard. He looked disastrous. His bespoke tuxedo jacket was unbuttoned. His bow tie hung askew, and a thick sheen of sweat coated his forehead. He was panting, his eyes darting wildly down the empty hallway to ensure we were alone. He practically lunged toward me, throwing away every ounce of the arrogant, patriarchal authority he had lorded over me for decades. Maya, wait," Richard gasped, holding his hands up in a desperate, placating gesture. "Please just listen to me for 1 minute. The IPO, it's brilliant. It's legendary. Let my firm handle the transition. We can co-sponsor the launch. I can restructure our entire portfolio to back you. We can keep this in the family. I can make it worth your while, I swear to God." He was begging. The man who had cannibalized my grandfather's legacy to build a criminal syndicate was sweating through his suit, begging me for a lifeline to save his own sinking ship. I didn't speak. I didn't blink. I maintained perfect lethal stillness as I looked at the pathetic, trembling man in front of me. Slowly, deliberately, I opened the clasp of my designer clutch. I reached inside and retrieved the sleek encrypted silver USB drive. It contained the final devastating SEC audit of his fraudulent empire, the exact blueprint of his imminent federal indictment. I stepped forward and pressed the cold metal drive into his trembling, sweaty palm. I closed his fingers around it, gave him one last silent look of absolute finality, and walked away down the corridor, leaving him alone in the dark. Richard stared down at the sleek silver USB drive I had just pressed into his sweaty palm. The ambient, muffled roar of the ballroom's standing ovation was still echoing through the marble corridor, a deafening reminder of the power dynamic that had just violently shifted. He turned the drive over in his hand, his breathing shallow and rapid. He didn't know exactly what digital execution orders were encrypted on it, but the absolute freezing calm in my eyes told him everything he needed to know. "What is this, Maya?" He rasped, his voice devoid of its usual booming patriarchal authority. He sounded small. He sounded terrified. I didn't answer him directly. I turned and gestured toward the heavy mahogany double doors of the Onyx Suite, a soundproofed VIP enclave located just off the main hallway, typically reserved for the evening's highest-tier philanthropic donors. "Find a monitor," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the undeniable weight of a command. "And get Eleanor. You have exactly 5 minutes before I leave this venue." I walked into the suite without waiting for his response. The room was cloaked in shadows and leather, smelling faintly of expensive bourbon and polished cedar. I took a seat at the head of the long, polished conference table, resting my hands flat against the cool grain of the wood. The quiet hum of the city traffic outside the reinforced glass was the only sound in the room. A few moments later, the brass handle clicked. Richard practically dragged my mother inside, locking the heavy deadbolt behind them. Eleanor's face was a mask of smeared contour and absolute bewilderment. The shock of my public speech, the humiliation of being cast aside by high society, and the sheer impossibility of my newfound status were still visibly vibrating through her rigid posture. She clutched her diamond necklace as if it were a life preserver. Richard scrambled to the presentation monitor mounted on the far wall. His hands were shaking so violently that he dropped the drive twice onto the carpet before successfully plugging it into the port. He tapped the screen. A single illuminated folder appeared. He didn't need a password. I had removed our military-grade firewalls specifically for this viewing. As the executive summary expanded across the 60-inch display, the last remnants of color drained completely from Richard's face. "This is a forensic map of your entire corporate existence," I stated, my voice clinical, detached, and utterly merciless. "My engineering team didn't just audit the logistics algorithm you stole from my grandfather's ledger. We audited the negative space around it. We tracked the artificial inflation of your domestic commercial properties. We traced the exact timestamps where you simultaneously and illegally depreciated those exact same assets for tax evasion purposes. We followed the illicit margins directly into the nested shell corporations you established in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands." Richard's knees gave out. He collapsed heavily into a leather chair, burying his face in his hands. A low, wretched sound escaped his throat, the sound of an empire turning to dust. "It's textbook wire fraud. It's money laundering. It's systemic institutional racketeering." I continued, holding his gaze as he peeked through his trembling fingers. "Your company isn't a legacy, Richard. It's an ongoing criminal syndicate wrapped in a glossy philanthropic tax write-off. And it is completely mathematically indefensible." Eleanor stared at the scrolling columns of red numbers illuminating the dark room. Her eyes darted from the monitor to Richard's broken form, and finally to me. I watched the realization wash over her in real time. The financial safety net she had traded her soul and her daughter to secure was disintegrating into ash right in front of her eyes. Then the most terrifying survival instinct I had ever witnessed kicked in. Her rigid posture softened instantly. Her shoulders rounded, her chin began to tremble, and a sudden glassy sheen of tears welled in her eyes. It was a masterful, immediate pivot. She took a slow step toward me, reaching out with a perfectly manicured shaking hand. "Maya," Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking with a manufactured, desperate maternal warmth. "Maya, my sweet, brilliant girl." She took another step, the heavy diamonds at her throat catching the harsh glow of the monitor. "I always knew. I always knew you had this extraordinary greatness inside of you. That's why we pushed you so hard, darling. We had to make you strong enough for this ruthless world. And look at you. You are magnificent." A single tear slipped down her cheek, timed with absolute theatrical perfection. "You've proven your point. You've won. But you have to protect us now. We are your family. You can fix this. You can absorb Richard's firm into yours, quietly correct the ledgers behind closed doors. You have the power to save us." I looked at her outstretched hand. A year ago, the desperate people-pleasing girl inside me would have crumbled at the sight of her mother's tears. But as I sat there draped in custom sapphire silk, I felt no anger, no sorrow, and absolutely no desire to be embraced. I felt nothing but a profound, icy clarity. Family. I repeated the word, tasting metallic and foreign on my tongue. I stood up slowly. I didn't raise my voice, but the absolute zero temperature of my tone stopped her dead in her tracks. Family doesn't pack a child's entire existence into black plastic trash bags and dump them on the sidewalk, I said, holding her gaze as her fake tears faltered. Family doesn't leave their daughter shivering on a deflated air mattress in a freezing, mold-infested apartment while they toast champagne in a mansion bought with stolen algorithms. You didn't push me to be great, Eleanor. You discarded me because my mere presence was an inconvenient reminder of the man you betrayed. Eleanor recoiled, her hand dropping limply to her side. The maternal mask slipped, revealing the terrified, cornered woman beneath. "I am not here for petty revenge," I continued, turning my attention back to the monitor. "I am here for a forensic correction. My grandfather died watching his life's work be cannibalized by a parasite. This is justice for his legacy mathematically executed." I looked down at Richard, who was now openly weeping into his palms, his broad shoulders shaking with terror. "There will be no buyout. There will be no quiet absorption," I stated. "Tomorrow morning at exactly 8 a.m., the unredacted files on that drive will be securely transmitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and the Federal Prosecutor's Office." "You can't do this!" Eleanor shrieked, the loving mother act instantly evaporating into a shrill, genuine panic. "You will destroy us." "You destroyed yourselves," I replied calmly. "I just turned on the lights." Before Eleanor could launch another volley of desperate manipulation, the heavy oak door of the suite burst open. It slammed against the wall with a deafening crack that made both Richard and Eleanor jump. Chloe stood in the threshold. She looked entirely feral. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled. Her mascara was slightly smudged beneath her wide eyes, and her breath was coming in ragged, furious gasps. She had clearly been sprinting through the venue searching for us. When she saw the financial audit glowing on the wall monitor, her face contorted into an expression of pure, unadulterated venom. "You think you've won!" Chloe screamed, stepping into the room and jabbing a trembling finger at me. "You think you can just walk in here and humiliate me in front of the entire venture board? I will ruin you. I have every major tech journalist in this city on speed dial. I will tell them you stole the code. I will say you engineered a hostile takeover. I will drag Aura Analytics through the mud and tank your entire IPO before the market even opens." She was raving, completely divorced from reality, lost in the delusion of her own untouchable status. She actually believed she still had the leverage to bully me into submission. "Shut your mouth, Chloe." The voice was a guttural, explosive roar. It didn't come from me. Richard shot up from his chair like he had been electrified. His face was a mottled purple, the veins bulging against the collar of his expensive, sweat-soaked shirt. He looked at his golden stepdaughter not with pride, but with a sudden, violent loathing. Chloe froze, entirely unaccustomed to Richard raising his voice at her. "Richard, I'm trying to protect the firm." "You killed the firm!" Richard bellowed, his voice cracking as he slammed his fist against the mahogany table so hard the impact rattled the floorboards. He pointed a shaking, accusatory finger directly at Chloe's face. "You think Maya's system just magically decided to look at our accounts? You think the SEC cares about a 10-year-old logistics patent?" Richard was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with a terrifying, broken realization. "It was you, Chloe. Your lavish business trips. Your phantom corporate expenses. You expensed a fleet of luxury cars and a private yacht to an empty shell company in the Caymans. Your reckless, unaccounted-for corporate spending is what triggered the federal monitoring algorithms in the first place." The heavy, frantic thud of Richard's fist hitting the mahogany conference table echoed like a gunshot through the soundproofed VIP suite. "Your phantom corporate expenses, you killed us!" Richard bellowed, his face a mottled, terrifying purple. He jabbed a trembling finger directly into Chloe's face. "You expensed a fleet of luxury cars and a private yacht to an empty shell company in the Caymans. Your reckless, unaccounted-for spending is what triggered the federal monitoring algorithms in the first place." Chloe's mouth opened and closed silently. The manic, desperate fury drained from her features in an instant, replaced by a hollow, breathless terror. The golden child, the ruthless venture capital prodigy, stood paralyzed as the reality set in. She was the architect of her own stepfather's federal indictment. Eleanor, witnessing the golden cage of her family tear itself to shreds, fell to her knees. She scrambled toward me, her diamond-clad hands grasping at the hem of my custom sapphire gown. "Maya, please," Eleanor sobbed. The performative high society warmth was completely gone, replaced by a raw, ugly desperation. "You can't leave us like this. You have to stop the audit. We are your blood. I am your mother." I looked down at her shaking hands, clutching my silk dress like a lifeline. I didn't step back. I didn't yell. I just looked at her with an absolute freezing calm. "You stopped being my mother the day you let Richard pack my childhood into black plastic trash bags," I said, my voice clinical and quiet. "You forfeited the right to the word family the night you left me shivering on a deflated air mattress, wondering why my existence was such a burden to you. I am not doing this for revenge, Eleanor. I am doing this for my grandfather." I smoothly pulled the fabric of my gown from her trembling fingers. "Tomorrow morning the SEC gets the unredacted files." I turned on my heel and walked out of the Onyx suite. The sound of Eleanor's wailing and Richard's frantic screaming was instantly silenced the moment the heavy double doors clicked shut behind me. Marcus was waiting in the corridor. We exchanged a single decisive nod. We walked out of the gala together, leaving them to burn in the ashes of their own greed. The deployment was surgical. At exactly 8 a.m. the following morning, Marcus and I executed the digital transfer from our secure servers. A comprehensive, irrefutable package of Richard's financial crimes, massive tax evasion, and illicit offshore routing was transmitted directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and the Federal Prosecutor's Office. Then we went to work. The next 3 weeks were an electric, breathless blur of corporate ascension. The Aura Analytics initial public offering became the single most anticipated tech launch of the decade. The morning we went public, the energy on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange was deafening. I stood on the iconic Bell balcony, looking out over the churning sea of cheering traders and flashing cameras. Marcus stood to my right, our lead engineers flanking my left. When I reached out and pressed the button to ring the opening bell, I didn't think of the family that had discarded me. I looked at the brilliant, dedicated team beside me, my chosen family, and felt a profound, unshakable warmth. Within hours, our stocks skyrocketed, bypassing our wildest billion-dollar valuations. We weren't just a tech unicorn anymore. We were an apex predator in the financial ecosystem. While we were ascending, Richard's empire was being violently dismantled. The fallout was swift, clinical, and brutal. Just days after our audit was received, federal agents descended on Richard's corporate headquarters. Every major news network broadcast the raid live. Helicopters circled his gleaming glass building as lines of FBI agents and federal marshals marched out the front doors, carrying dozens of cardboard boxes, hard drives, filing cabinets, and encrypted servers. The indictment was unsealed before the end of the week. Richard was formally charged with systemic wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. The federal prosecutor moved with terrifying speed, immediately freezing every single one of his domestic and international assets. The Cyprus accounts, the Cayman Island shell companies, the sprawling domestic real estate portfolio, all of it was seized, locked behind an impenetrable wall of federal red tape. The social execution of Eleanor and Chloe was instantaneous and absolute. In the ruthless hierarchy of high society, financial contagion is treated like a terminal illness. Their elite country club memberships were revoked overnight. The philanthropic boards Eleanor had bullied her way onto quietly and permanently removed her name from their letterheads. Without access to Richard's frozen wealth, their reality shattered. I monitored the collapse through brief objective updates. Marcus would occasionally slide across my desk. The fire sale was humiliating. The fleet of luxury cars was repossessed first. Then came the frantic, desperate pawning of Eleanor's jewelry, the very diamonds she had weaponized against me at the gala, sold for pennies on the dollar to secure cash for defense attorney retainers. Within a month, the bank formally foreclosed on the sprawling suburban mansion. The golden child and the matriarch were evicted, forced to pack whatever remnants of their shattered lives they could scavenge into the trunks of rented sedans. I thought the silence from them would be permanent. I deeply underestimated the sheer terrifying delusion of a narcissist who had lost her audience. It happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Aura Analytics had recently moved our global headquarters into a towering, state-of-the-art glass skyscraper in the city's financial district. The main lobby was a fortress of polished white marble, biometric security turnstiles, and a highly trained, imposing security detail. I was in the middle of a quarterly board meeting when the emergency line on my desk phone illuminated. I picked it up. It was David, my head of corporate security. "Ms. Vance, my sincere apologies for the interruption." David's voice was tight with professional restraint. "We have a severe disturbance in the main lobby. A woman bypassed the initial screening desk and is screaming at the guards demanding access to your private executive elevator. She claims to be your mother." I tapped my tablet, pulling up the live security feed from the ground floor. I almost didn't recognize her. The immaculate, terrifying woman who had terrorized my youth was completely gone. Eleanor looked frantic, haggard, and soaked from the rain. She wore a wrinkled trench coat over clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in days. Her perfectly coiffed hair was plastered to her forehead, and she was violently waving her arms, shrieking at two towering security guards who had formed a physical barricade in front of the elevators. "I will handle this, David," I said calmly. "Hold her there. Do not let her call the police." I excused myself from the board, stepped into the private executive elevator, and began the long descent to the ground floor. My heart wasn't racing, my hands weren't shaking. The suffocating anxiety that used to choke me in her presence had been entirely eradicated, replaced by a quiet, immovable armor. The polished steel doors of the elevator slid silently open. Eleanor's head snapped toward the sound. The moment she saw me stepping into the marble lobby, flanked by David and two other guards, her face contorted in a bizarre mix of manic relief and desperate entitlement. Maya, tell these rent-a-cops to stand down immediately, she shrieked, trying to shove past the barricade. Tell them who I am. I raised a single hand. The guards stepped back, maintaining a secure perimeter but giving us space. I didn't step closer. I stood perfectly still, letting the vast, cold architecture of my building frame the impossible distance between us. Maya, darling, thank God! Eleanor babbled her words, spilling out in a rapid, hysterical torrent. It's an absolute nightmare. The feds took everything. The house, the accounts, the cars. Richard is looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Chloe won't even answer my calls. She blames me for the audit. I have nothing, Maya. I have nowhere to go. She took a trembling step forward, her eyes wide and completely devoid of reality. You have to let me come upstairs, she pleaded, her voice echoing off the marble walls. We can fix this. You're a billionaire now. A few million to pay the legal fees is a drop in the bucket for you. You can buy us a new house. You can save us. You have to save your family. I looked at the woman who had systematically attempted to break my spirit for 25 years. I looked at the hands that had eagerly snatched my inheritance, the mouth that had called me a pathetic failure. I felt no anger. I felt no urge to scream. I just felt a profound, chilling finality. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and withdrew a thick, crisp, legal envelope. I stepped forward and held it out to her. Eleanor snatched it eagerly, a triumphant, tearful smile breaking across her haggard face. She ripped the flap open, her fingers fumbling inside, clearly expecting a cashier's check with enough zeros to resurrect her dead social life. She pulled out a thick stack of notarized paper. Her eyes scanned the top page, her triumphant smile faltering into deep confusion. A deed, Eleanor whispered, looking up at me, her hands trembling. What is this? It is the legal deed to grandmother's house, I said, my voice cutting through the quiet lobby like a striking bell. The home you tried to steal from her, the legacy you tried to pawn off. My blind trust purchased the property last week. The mortgage is fully paid off, the back taxes are settled, and the deed is entirely in your name. Eleanor stared at the paper, her mouth opening and closing as the reality of the document crushed her delusions. But the lawyers, the money for Richard's defense, my life. You have a roof over your head. I stated, my tone absolute and unyielding. That is the absolute limit of my familial obligation to you. You will never see another cent of my money, and you will never hold another shred of power over my life. I turned to David, who was watching the exchange with strict professional detachment. This woman is no longer welcome on Aura Analytics property, I instructed quietly. If she attempts to enter this lobby again, have her arrested for criminal trespassing. The silence that followed Richard's explosive roar was thick and suffocating. Chloe's mouth worked soundlessly, the color draining from her perfectly contoured face, until she looked sickly pale and entirely hollowed out. The realization that her own insatiable greed, her phantom yacht rentals, her luxury car, leases, her desperate attempts to maintain the illusion of venture capital royalty had been the very beacon that drew the federal spotlight onto Richard's offshore accounts, crushed the breath right out of her lungs. Eleanor stared at the two of them, her eyes darting frantically back and forth. The golden alliance that had sustained her lavish parasitic lifestyle was detonating in real time. The room erupted. They began screaming at each other, their voices echoing off the polished cedar walls, tearing into one another with the vicious, desperate cruelty of starving wolves turning on their own pack. I didn't stay to watch the rest of the carnage. I turned my back on the screaming match, my posture perfectly aligned, and gave Marcus a single decisive nod. He held the heavy mahogany doors open for me, and we walked out into the corridor, leaving them to burn in the ashes of the empire they had stolen. The weeks that followed passed in a breathless electric blur of absolute vindication. Aura Analytics didn't just go public. It erupted onto the market in one of the most successful and highly publicized initial public offerings of the decade. The morning of the launch, I stood on the iconic Bell balcony of the New York Stock Exchange, the harsh bright lights illuminating the culmination of a lifetime of survival. The trading floor below was a churning sea of flashing cameras, cheering traders and television crews, broadcasting the moment globally. When I gripped the wooden gavel and struck the opening bell, the sound reverberated through my very bones. I didn't think of the family that had discarded me. I didn't think of the freezing studio apartment above the laundromat, or the nights I spent rationing tap water to suppress my hunger. I looked to my left and my right, flanked by Marcus, my brilliant lead engineers, and the fiercely loyal team that had built this company from the ground up. This was my real family. The confetti rained down, the screens flashed a vibrant green, and our valuation soared past the billion-dollar mark before the first hour of trading had concluded. We were no longer a tech startup. We were an apex predator in the financial ecosystem. While we ascended to the absolute peak of the industry, Richard's fraudulent empire was being violently and publicly dismantled. The fallout was swift, clinical, and merciless. Just 3 days after our encrypted audit was transmitted, federal agents descended upon Richard's corporate headquarters. The raid was broadcast live on every major news network. News helicopters circled his gleaming glass building like vultures, as lines of FBI agents and federal marshals marched out through the lobby carrying dozens of cardboard boxes, confiscated hard drives, and encrypted servers. The indictment was unsealed by the end of the week. Richard was formally charged with 72 counts of massive corporate fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. The federal prosecutor moved with terrifying lethal efficiency, immediately freezing every single one of his domestic and international assets. The Cyprus shell corporations, the Cayman Island accounts, the sprawling domestic real estate portfolio, all of it was locked behind an impenetrable wall of federal red tape. Eleanor and Chloe were brutally introduced to the reality of the world they had always mocked. Their fall from high society was absolute and instantaneous. In the ruthless hierarchy of the elite, financial contagion is treated like a terminal illness. Their exclusive country club memberships were revoked overnight. The philanthropic boards Eleanor had bullied her way onto quietly erased her name from their letterheads, distancing themselves from the radioactive fallout of Richard's crimes. Without access to Richard's frozen wealth, their carefully curated reality shattered into a million jagged pieces. I monitored their collapse through objective detached updates Marcus would occasionally slide across my desk. The fire sale was deeply humiliating. The fleet of leased luxury cars was repossessed from their driveway in broad daylight, while their wealthy neighbors watched from behind drawn curtains. To afford the astronomical retainers required by Richard's criminal defense attorneys, Eleanor was forced to endure the ultimate indignity, pawning the stolen, extravagant diamond jewelry she had weaponized against me for decades, selling it all for pennies on the dollar. Then came the final nail in the coffin. The bank formally foreclosed on their sprawling suburban mansion. The golden child and the matriarch were evicted. They were forced to pack whatever meager remnants of their shattered lives they could scavenge into the trunks of rented sedans, permanently exiled from the iron gates of their elite community. I thought the sheer crushing humiliation of their new reality would keep them away from me. I profoundly underestimated the terrifying delusion of a narcissist who had entirely lost her audience. It happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Aura Analytics had recently moved our global operations into a towering, state-of-the-art glass skyscraper in the heart of the financial district. The main lobby was a fortress of polished white marble biometric security turnstiles and a highly trained, imposing security detail. I was in the middle of reviewing international expansion schematics in the executive suite when the emergency line on my desk phone illuminated. I picked it up. It was Elias, my head of corporate security. "Ms. Vance, my sincere apologies for the interruption." Elias's voice was tight with professional restraint. "We have a severe disturbance in the main lobby. A woman bypassed the initial visitor screening desk and is currently screaming at the guards demanding access to your private executive elevator. She claims to be your mother. I tapped my tablet, pulling up the live security feed from the ground floor. I almost didn't recognize her. The immaculate, terrifying woman who had governed my youth with an iron fist was completely gone. Eleanor looked frantic, haggard, and soaked from the freezing rain. She wore a wrinkled trench coat over clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed or pressed in days. Her perfectly coiffed hair was plastered to her forehead in wet, chaotic strands, and she was violently waving her arms, shrieking at two towering security guards who had formed a physical barricade in front of the elevator banks. "I will handle this, Elias," I said calmly. "Hold her there. Do not let her call the police. I am coming down." I stepped into the private executive elevator and began the long descent to the ground floor. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. The suffocating anxiety that used to paralyze me in her presence had been entirely eradicated, replaced by a quiet, immovable armor of absolute certainty. The polished steel doors of the elevator slid silently open. Eleanor's head snapped toward the sound. The moment she saw me stepping into the vast marble lobby flanked by Elias and two other guards, her face contorted into a bizarre, unsettling mix of manic relief and desperate entitlement. "Maya, tell these rent-a-cops to stand down immediately!" she shrieked, trying to shove her way past the barricade. "Tell them who I am!" I raised a single hand. The guards stepped back, maintaining a secure perimeter, but granting her space. I didn't step closer. I stood perfectly still, letting the soaring cold architecture of my building frame the impossible distance that now existed between us. "Maya, darling, thank God!" Eleanor babbled her words, spilling out in a rapid, hysterical torrent as she rushed toward me. "It's an absolute nightmare. The feds took everything, the house, the accounts, the cars. Richard is looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Chloe won't even answer my calls. She blames me for the audit. I have nothing, Maya. I have nowhere to go." She took a trembling step forward, her eyes wide and completely divorced from reality. "You have to let me come upstairs," she pleaded, her voice echoing off the marble walls, steeped in a sickening, manufactured maternal warmth. "We can fix this. You're a billionaire now. A few million to pay the legal fees is a drop in the bucket for you. You can buy us a new house. You can restore our accounts. You have to save us. You have to save your family." I looked at the woman who had systematically attempted to break my spirit for 25 years. I looked at the hands that had eagerly snatched my inheritance, the mouth that had called me a pathetic failure, the eyes that had watched me freeze on an air mattress without a shred of pity. I felt no anger. I felt no urge to scream. I just felt a profound, chilling finality. Without breaking eye contact, I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and withdrew a thick, crisp, legal envelope. I stepped forward and held it out to her. Eleanor snatched it eagerly, a triumphant, tearful smile breaking across her haggard face. She ripped the flap open, her fingers fumbling inside, clearly expecting a cashier's check with enough zeros to resurrect her dead social life. She pulled out a thick stack of notarized paper. Her eyes scanned the top page, her triumphant smile faltering slowly, melting into a mask of deep, horrified confusion. "A deed," Eleanor whispered, looking up at me, her hands trembling violently. "What is this?" "It is the legal deed to grandmother's house," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet lobby like a striking bell. "The modest 3-bedroom home you tried to force her to sell, the legacy you viewed as an inconvenience. My blind trust purchased the property last week. The mortgage is fully paid off, the back taxes are settled, and the deed is entirely in your name." Eleanor stared at the paper, her mouth opening and closing as the reality of the document crushed her grand illusions. "But the lawyers, the money for Richard's defense, my life in the Heights. Maya, this is a shack in the suburbs. You have a roof over your head. I stated my tone absolute and unyielding. That is the absolute limit of my familial obligation to you. You will never see a single cent of my corporate wealth, and you will never hold another shred of power over my life. I turned to Elias, who was watching the exchange with strict professional detachment. This woman is permanently banned from the premises, I instructed, quietly, turning my back on my mother for the final time. If she attempts to enter this lobby again, have her arrested for criminal trespassing.